recording. Dan, how are you doing?
Very well, Brendan. How are you doing? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. I'm doing well. So thank you for taking the time to be on the podcast. Really appreciate it. So to kind of kick it off, you want to tell me a little bit about your backgrounds, what you do, how you kind of got interested in blockchain in the first place, to kind of give the audience an idea of who you are and what you do.
Sounds good. So Dan O'Prey, I'm currently the Chief Strategy Officer at a company called Digital Asset. Been in the industry for about 6 years or so now. Co-founded a company called HyperLedger back in early 2014, which ended up being acquired by Digital Asset. And then I've had a couple of different roles internally within DA at the last sort of 4 or 5 years or so. So currently, very much focused on, looking at how what's sort of commonly known as the enterprise blockchain part of the industry, or the permissioned ledger piece, very much dealing with, existing commercial entities, small businesses, all the way up to large enterprises and financial institutions, and how they are looking at the technology and adopting it in order to bring benefit to their current business.
Gotcha. How would you define enterprise blockchain versus, the blockchain we all kind of know?
Yeah, I think that, the core is there's a great deal of overlap, but they're, almost entirely separate, I would say. And it's not that fashionable to say necessarily. But really, the core design decisions are whether you need censorship resistance or not. So if you're trying to build a censorship resistance peer-to-peer electronic cash, obviously you need censorship resistance. And then the architecture of what you're building really stems out of that initial problem statement, that value prop to the user. However, when you're dealing with companies in the physical world who have offices, who are issuing stock, or they're banks, and they're the liability, they have the liability for cash. Censorship resistance isn't the key design decision you're trying to solve for. It's really all around how do we make sure that everyone that's relevant to a transaction sees the same thing, and how do we make sure everyone agrees on how do we update that. So when you start from the context of there are known entities, they have to be identified, they have to be permissioned, there's KYC, KYV, know your vendor, and all of this is very much dealing with this sort of known world. It's how do we leverage the technology to enable companies to build applications that actually span markets rather than just sit siloed inside a single company.
Gotcha. Is this something that we're seeing more often nowadays, this pursuit of an enterprise blockchain amongst bigger companies, or is it still relatively new?
It's been going on for quite some time now. So we have, a couple of very large projects with big, say, stock exchanges, for example. We're most known for our work with the Australian Securities Exchange, the ASX. We've been working with them since, don't want to misspeak, but 2016, 2015, perhaps, if I can recall. And so this has been a project that's several years in already, and is actually replacing the core infrastructure for the Australian stock market. So every single stock that's listed in Australia will be represented by smart contracts and by on an underlying blockchain. And this is going live in the next couple of years due to the nature of the size of the project. So there's been immense amounts of interest on the enterprise side. And when I say enterprise, that doesn't just mean Fortune 1000. It's counting small and medium-sized businesses in there as well, just as opposed to the sort of crypto / free-flowing token side of things. So that a lot of interest, a lot of very well-funded companies, consortia, open source projects, new standards body. It's really been something that's continues to gain more and more momentum over the last 5-6 years.
Very cool. Very cool. I also heard that you helped found HyperLedger. What was kind of your role there? How did you guys kind of come to do that?
Yeah, so just as sort of point of clarification for the audience. There's two HyperLedgers. There is the I've been involved in both. There's the now Linux Foundation project, which we helped set up with the Linux Foundation and with IBM and several others back in a few years ago, 2 years or so. And then prior to that, and where the Linux Foundation project got its name, was a very small company that I was a co-founder of with one of my colleagues, Daniel Feichtinger, who's also with Digital Asset. When we I was personally extremely interested in Bitcoin. That was my entry point. Around that time, Ethereum hadn't launched yet. I think the yellow paper was out, and people were looking at how can we leverage this technology and particularly expand the scope of the functionality towards what are now commonly known as smart contracts. And we were looking from a different angle. As I said, sort of how do we apply this to existing businesses rather than rebuild the sort of financial system from scratch, or how can we help apply this to companies that already exist? So we started HyperLedger. It was just the two of us. We started, exploring. Neither of us were from finance or knew, really the first thing about actually how these very complex instruments and systems and market structures actually work behind the scenes, which was quite a interesting and long journey. But really, towards let's say the end of 2014, there was a huge influx of interest from financial institutions in the technology, and unfortunately for us, we'd sort of positioned ourselves as the one on their side, so to say, versus the we're out to completely replace you. And so that was really the sort of start of the journey that led us to ending up being acquired by Digital Asset. And then after that, oops, sorry, I've got some dogs in the background.
No worries.
Let's pause there for a second. Then after joining Digital Asset, as mentioned, worked with IBM, and we had been working with them previously, and there became so much interest in this space. It was open source, by its nature of being a multi-organizational technology. Really for the core protocol to catch on and become widely adopted, it had to be not governed by a single vendor, and that's where the Linux Foundation bring their expertise in. And so we established a project there with the goal of sort of getting everyone on the more enterprise side together to collaborate on some pieces and compete on others. And that's where HyperLedger, the Linux Foundation project, was formed, and we donated the trademark and some code, and I served as the chair of the marketing committee there for 3 years.
Nice. Sounds pretty cool. You said it was acquired by Digital Asset, right?
Yes. Yep. So they were just about to launch, sort of coming public, and we joined just before their sort of big launch day.
Gotcha. So what's your role at Digital Asset now, and kind of what's the mission?
Yeah, so the mission, I'll start there, is really, we're trying to build, it sounds very similar to the mission of Ethereum in some ways. It's to build the global economic network for commerce. And, it's deliberately not tied to blockchain or tied to smart contracts. Where we sort of fit is we're not trying to build a better blockchain or distributed ledger piece of the stack. We focus purely on the sort of application development. How can we build smart contracts in an actually a safe and secure way? So we've created a language from the ground up called DAML, DAML. You can find more info at daml.com. And that is an actually purpose-built domain-specific language for the domain of multi-party business processes or systems, or however you want to think about it, but for building applications which have shared state and shared logic that span across companies in a safe and a secure way. So that's really what our core focus is. We then partner with various blockchain providers. So some of the biggest ones are VMware. We're doing work with Microsoft. We have integrations with HyperLedger Fabric, Sawtooth, Bezu, with R3's Corda. So any of the main sort of Ethereum variant or permission blockchains in the space.
Gotcha. Are there have you guys come up with any solutions or products out of digital asset lately? Or is it mostly just partnerships and testing, or like what kind of stage are you at? Like how far along is it?
Yep, great question. So, I mean, our core product is a horizontal, infrastructural component in the similar way that the blockchain is, just at the smart contract layer. So that has applicability, for any application that others want to build on top of the technology. Mm-hmm. So we don't, build solutions or the sort of use case products ourselves. We make that technology available to others, and we help them to be as successful as they can. But really, that's the sort of domain of our ecosystem rather than us as a tech company. Mm-hmm. But in terms of what our customers and partners are doing with it, I mentioned the Australian Securities Exchange, complete mission critical replacement project. We tend to be dealing with some of we made the in hindsight, maybe difficult decision to start with some of the hardest use cases in the world. The things that underpin the economies of entire countries, which maybe as a startup I wouldn't do again, but it worked out quite well this time. Mm-hmm. And so, working with them on a clearing and settlement for equities solution. We have a couple of other stock exchange customers, some of which are going to be public shortly. We have projects and customers have projects in insurance and healthcare, and then we have some various startups building with our technology as well. There's a smaller company called New ID, which is building using DAML as a way to manage zero knowledge proofs for passwordless authentication. Which is a really interesting application of the tech that we hadn't thought of, but it turns out is a really good example of what you can do with it. Someone at Google was using it to manage certificates in web browsers. We ourselves have been sort of experimenting with some productivity SaaS apps. So we have an open source Trello clone and an open source Slack clone, both built in DAML, available at opensasami.org. And kind of thinking there is actually to show break people's perceptions of what smart contracts are. I mean, right now, most people who know what they are tend to think of them as these autonomous, almost autonomous agents which take escrow of funds, apply some logic to it, and essentially move it between these various different accounts, which works well for things like cash, which are bearer instruments, right? Whoever has possession owns it. But for things which have rights or obligations over if you must do this at this point, or you have the right to make someone else do something at some point, that kind of token model breaks down a little bit. So by building out something as simple as a Trello clone, which is very workflow oriented, we're hoping to show that smart contracts actually have a much wider applicability, and can be used even for SaaS products. And also the particularly interesting angle for me is around privacy. So how do we start to build applications where even the admins of these systems don't get to see all your data? And as everyone sees in the world of social networks at the moment, that's becoming a more and more interesting a topic that I think this technology can help with significantly.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. There's definitely some privacy issues in the world we live in today. And it sounds like you guys are doing a lot too. Regarding smart contracts, how does your guys' ecosystem differ from that of something like Ethereum that's already kind of popular and is a staple for building on top of?
Yeah, so we're not sort of directly competing with the Ethereum ecosystem, although there are, if sort of on a technical basis, we're kind of competing with Solidity and the EVM, I suppose. So it is certainly an alternative to that. So while we integrate DAML with Ethereum-based clients like HyperLedger Besu, which was originally from Consensus, you're either choosing Solidity or DAML. And I think, we didn't set out when we started this company to have to build our own programming language. That certainly wasn't in the original roadmap. But we quickly found, having used each of these ourselves, we were in the fortunate position of, in a time where use cases were thin and sparse, we had a project with the ASX, a real customer with real requirements, a real actual system that they were replacing and decommissioning. And so we quickly sort of iterated through the available technologies at the time, and some of them have evolved more than others, but I think quickly found that using general purpose languages, I know Solidity is sort of slightly a DSL, but JavaScript inspired, or trying to go to communities that are large communities of Java developers or Go developers or JavaScript developers. It makes it very easy for them to pick up, but it makes it down the line very, very difficult to make sure that these systems are actually secure. That was proven out in various instances of the parity hack and the DAO exploit. And really, we had to build a language which was both expressive in terms of being able to model a wide variety of different use cases beyond just simply moving tokens between wallets, and yet secure enough that it wasn't left to the developer to worry about concerns like security and privacy. That was a separate area of concern that the language handles automatically for them.
Gotcha. Maybe I'm being naive, but is it possible to use your guys' programming language to build something on Ethereum, or for it to potentially replace something like Solidity that is kind of necessary, but also not very helpful in every situation?
It's theoretically possible. I think it'd be to put it on I'd love to see DAML on a public chain, for example, and we have had interest and conversations around that with various different foundations. DAML's really designed around real secure privacy, and making sure that, particularly in the kinds of markets that our customers deal in, there is no room for sharing data just for confidentiality reasons, competitive reasons, and then regulatory reasons. And so if you were to, DAML kind of needs the underlying ledger to reflect some of those properties that it has by design, particularly around privacy. So if you were to put DAML on something which shares everything with everyone, DAML can't stop it from doing that. It will share everything with everyone. And so you lose some of the benefits of that the language brings, depending on the capabilities of the underlying platform. So it would be possible. I think it's certainly something interesting. There are all kinds of sort of technical nuances there on the payload sizes of DAML transactions versus Solidity, and what the gas prices for those would be. But we'd certainly, our goal is to move towards more of a globally interconnected economic network, and having Ethereum as part of that would certainly be, very much of interest to me.
Is it cheaper to build on? 'Cause with Ethereum, there seems to be quite a consistent issue with gas prices cropping up, and then having a bottleneck and it slowing down. Do you guys have similar issues, or does it solve that issue?
Yeah, so that sort of goes back to the original distinction between that mentioned earlier about the public permissionless and the more enterprise or permissioned. Mm-hmm. In the case of permission networks, you don't need gas is the short version. Gas really is, how do I anonymously pay someone who's providing me a compute service, without them being able to tamper with the transactions. And so, the people who are operating the nodes are providing a service to the network, and their incentive for doing that is, not only the block rewards, but the fee structure, in this case in gas. And so when you're looking in a world where, existing companies, the people run their own servers, people run their own infrastructure, they run it on AWS. That's just the cost of doing business and cost of participating in the network. They don't need to be directly compensated by others for processing those transactions. Mm-hmm. So in DAML, you're only validating transactions that you're a party to. There's no third party who's providing that as a service. So it's architecturally very different from something like Ethereum. And therefore, it's just, if I want to be part of the network, I run my own server and, I pay my bills.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes sense. Speaking of smart contracts a bit more broadly, because I know we kind of talked about it a little bit from an enterprise side, but how do you see smart contracts actually shaping the world, and like what kind of impact do you think it'll have more broadly?
It's a tough question, and I like to get excited about the long term and the sort of long term vision. That's why I got into this space in the first place, and continue to spend 6 years of my life on it. But then, obviously, you also got to balance that with immediate value provided, because no one adopts and buys into. Let's say, companies very few companies can afford to make a 10-year bet on a technology, for example. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of long-winded intro to saying there are more short-term, sort of low-hanging, incremental or single order of magnitude benefits to the technology today. Those tend to be around, reducing cost and risk, and increasing, efficiency and time to market for new products and services. So that's kind of a sort of modernization angle to, when companies are looking at why should they do this now versus later. There's significant cost savings or reduction of time to market that can give them a competitive advantage today. And then in terms of the sort of the long-term vision, that's where it becomes a little bit blurrier. And I don't think, really anyone's perfectly articulated what that world's going to look like. In the same way that when the internet first came around, it's about replicating data and sharing data efficiently. This is really about replicating state or ensuring that state is updated efficiently. And so it's adding scarcity or state to the internet. Mm-hmm. So the types of applications that are going to be possible because of that are by their nature sort of harder to predict. Where I get excited is kind of looking at even trends in the current tech world of componentization and composability of people talk about the unbundling of finance or unbundling of the enterprise, where startups are picking off certain products and services they offer, and that's their core business, and they do that and they expose it as APIs, and you build essentially you build your business by stitching together a variety of third-party services. It might be AWS or Twilio or Stripe, and then what you're building as part of your business increasingly becomes less and less and less. So the easiest example is with cloud. You used to have a data center. Now you just say, okay, you manage all that for me and just give me compute and other things as a service. And now that's obviously happened with SaaS and API as a service. And that's the sort of trend that I find really fascinating is in the future, once you have a network like this, running something like DAML, where you can compose together, a variety of all these different components, the actual code base or the scope of what you have to create to launch your business becomes dramatically smaller because you're extending and plugging into so much that's already there and shared and available. And that, I think, will cause a kind of exponential increase in innovation, and particularly among startups. And who knows, we might see the first sort of $1 billion one-person company once this really takes off.
Yeah, it's a fun trend to watch. It seems like every major company has kind of got their toes in the water on this one, at least to a degree. One more question before we kind of start wrapping things up. I was also told that you guys are involved with a working group called Interwork Alliance. kind of helping advance this idea of a token economy. Was kind of curious if you could talk a little bit about that for a second, like what you guys are doing there,
Sure.
and what you guys mean by token economy.
Sure. So, Interwork Alliance is a new open standards organization that was announced a couple of weeks ago. And, very much aligned with, kind of our mission and what we're trying to do in the industry, which is move away from a world where we've got, let's just say 10 different technologies, all competing as sort of full stack solutions. So if you want to build an application, you pick Ethereum, and then because you picked Ethereum, you have to use EVM. Because you picked EVM, you have to use Solidity. And because you use Solidity, you have to use XYZ tools. So it's kind of a take it or leave it everything. And that's true of R3's Corda, of HyperLedger Fabric, and most platforms in this space. So, as previous technologies have developed, they do tend to start like that as kind of monolithic blobs. But over time, interfaces start to emerge between layers. And then people start to specialize at each of those different layers, and they become things that can be plugged together in a sort of standard technology stack. And as we've been doing with DAML, by decoupling smart contracts from the underlying ledger and letting DAML applications written in DAML run on any of the ledgers that are supported, the Interwork Alliance is working towards how do we do technology neutral definitions of tokens. That's the first project, the token taxonomy framework, which was actually started under the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. So how as a sort of business level can we define and actually document what we mean by a particular type of token, and then let's go and choose the right technology to actually implement that. So that's the first stage on the token side, and a token here is not necessarily the strict technical definition of what a token is. It really is any kind of programmable form of digital asset that is can be connected with other systems. So slightly wider view than the say ERC20 token spec, and beyond that sort of token definition, the next piece is then a working group called the Interwork framework. And that really is focused on, okay, now we have those business level definitions of what tokens are. How do we translate that into ensuring that these contracts or these tokens can be interoperable across different technology systems? So one of the things that it's great when early on in an industry you have this sort of Cambrian explosion of different approaches and ideas and architectures, which is fantastic for innovation. But you as a customer are looking at it going, okay, which one do I pick, and will it be around, and will it be the best one next year or the year after? And now we've got these huge companies like Microsoft and VMware, coming out with their own offerings. If I pick the one from last year, am I going to be left on my own little island next year? Am I going to get locked into a particular vendor and they're just going to ratchet up the prices on me and end up paying massive bills unless I rewrite my whole application? So it gives a lot of comfort, not just comfort, but safety and security to people adopting this technology, knowing that working towards things which will actually enable them to work together. And if the one they pick doesn't turn out to be the best one, they will be able to easily move to another technology without throwing away absolutely everything that they've done.
Gotcha. Yeah, tokenization seems to be a pretty popular topic, an interesting way to use smart contracts to really gain more mainstream popularity. Do you think tokenization, like being able to use tokens more widely and freely in society or in an economy, is feasible, like given the state of where smart contracts are at, or is that something that would take significant amount of time to develop alongside smart contracts?
Well, I'm afraid the sort of answer depends on the definition of tokens there. I think, for most people, tokens, when they think about it, are things that run on Ethereum, like the various utility coin style tokens. or representations of diamonds or off-ledger assets. And those are like Bitcoin, like ETH, free-moving bearer assets. And again, bearer asset meaning you control it, you own it. Vast majority of the world's assets aren't bearer assets. They're things that actually your bank needs to promise to give you in the future when you make a cash deposit, or you put gold in a safety box and someone says, okay, I promise you I'll give you this in the future. So most assets are really around those promises, those liabilities, and contractual relationships between individuals and companies. And the strict sort of free-flowing bearer instrument model doesn't really work for that, because you can put a token in escrow, but if that token is a representation of some gold in a vault and someone runs off with the gold, cool, right? What are you going to do about it? And that's just an extremely simple example. And then the other side is regulatory and compliance. Quickly, if you're building something completely censorship resistant, you're a decentralized team that's anonymous and untouchable. That's one thing, but again, 99% of probably the value of this technology is going to come from real world companies, and so they have to comply, with these AML, KYC laws, and can't just say, okay, here, this token now represents a piece of my stock. Who wants to buy it and who wants to trade it and send it to Iran? I don't mind. There are sanctions and massive fines towards these. So, so that form of token, I think, has I don't want to say it has no utility. I think it's certainly a very interesting area for a relatively narrow range of applications in the world. But when you look at most forms of value, they are not they're not like a dollar bill that you can just hand to someone. They're a house or a mortgage or a loan or whatever it may be. That some of the DeFi concepts and approaches don't actually represent. They only represent a fraction of the complexity that actually exists in these things. So for me, tokens is sort of shorthand for programmable, connectable digital assets. So not things which are just sitting on someone's server and exposed through an API, but actually live on some form of interconnected network. And those, absolutely. So there'll be $3 trillion of Australian securities on a blockchain in the next couple of years, straight to the top of coin market cap. So we'll see a lot of that, and there's tons of those projects going on across the world, in Hong Kong and Switzerland and Singapore, and all over the place. So that the notional values of the assets that are being quote unquote tokenized and put onto blockchains here is absolutely huge, and the benefit of having them be accessible, programmable, and connected is again massive.
Yeah, I would agree. It's very exciting to see where everything's going to go. And it's awesome seeing all the development that's happened over the past decade, especially with smart contracts. I actually have to run right now, so I'm thinking we're going to wrap it up here. But
no problem.
Dan, thanks for taking the time to come on and everything. Really appreciate it. I think the audience will really appreciate it. Great conversation. Would love to have you again in the near future. But yeah, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Happy to. Thanks so much for the opportunity, Brandon. Really enjoyed it.
Of course, anytime. Joanne, Vera, if you're still listening, thank you for being here too. Appreciate it.
Well, this is great.
Thanks so much. Speak soon.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye, guys.